In 1941, 3 young Navajo girls vanished from a federal boarding school in Pennsylvania. There was no missing persons report, no investigation. According to official records, they never existed. 40 years later, in a small church in the New Mexico desert, their older brother saw a nun with a familiar scar on her left temple. A small detail until he realized it might mean his sister was still alive. Following the trail, he uncovered a monastery hidden behind fences and religious silence. And beneath it, a stone cellar, where the sound of screaming and whipping echoed beneath the chanting of scripture, a truth buried for 40 years, was about to come to light. Chinle, Arizona, 1985. A 58-year-old man lived quietly in a rusted-out camper parked at the edge of the desert. His name was Daniel Nez. Most people in town barely noticed him anymore. They called him that drunk Navajo, a man living off welfare checks and cheap beer. But what no one knew was that Daniel carried with him a secret that had gone unanswered for 40 years. That secret was folded inside an old, wrinkled newspaper he always kept on the passenger seat. It was an article from 1945, praising the success of the federal Indian boarding school program. Beneath the headline was a black-and-white photograph. 3 young Navajo girls in white dresses sitting on the steps of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School chapel. Behind them, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, stood a white priest holding a Bible. Daniel knew every detail in that photo. The oldest, Tasba, had her hands folded over her knees, her face caught between fear and sadness. The middle girl, Alona, tilted her head slightly because of an old shoulder injury, and the youngest, Kaya, only 8 years old, already wore an expression far too serious for her age. Those 3 girls were Daniel's sisters, and the day after that photograph was taken, they disappeared. There was no investigation, no flyers. The school simply said the girls had been adopted by a Catholic family back east. But Daniel never believed it, because he was the last person to see them alive during chapel the next morning. When he asked the nuns where his sisters were, they beat him, locked him in the basement for 3 days, and afterward they told him, "You never had any sisters." He knew it was a lie. And from that moment on, Daniel began a search that would last 4 decades. After 3 days locked in the basement, Daniel was released. His body was bruised, but what weighed heavier was the emptiness. No one at the school mentioned the girls. Their names were erased from the class rosters. Their beds in the dormitory were reassigned. And the students who used to call them by their Navajo names, Tasba, Alona, Kaya, suddenly acted like they'd never known them. Daniel tried to quietly ask around. Most avoided the question. One boy gave a small nod when asked about Alona, but the next day he was punished with 2 days of forced labor in the yard without water. No one spoke after that. Then, one morning during Mass, Father Reginald Milford, the same priest from the newspaper photo, stood before the students and said, "We must learn to let go of things that never were. Those who are no longer here have been taken by God's will. We do not need to speak their names again." Daniel understood then. His sisters hadn't been adopted. They had been made to disappear, and the people running the school had orchestrated it. In 1949, at age 18, Daniel left Carlisle and never went back. He moved from New Mexico to Arizona to Utah, taking whatever jobs he could find. But no matter where he went, he always carried that old newspaper. It was the last proof that his 3 sisters had ever existed, proof the world seemed intent on erasing. For 40 years, he searched in vain. He asked churches, native communities, remote monasteries. Sometimes he got a quiet refusal, sometimes averted eyes. But most of the time, no one believed him. If they were never reported missing, then there's no missing persons case. That's what a police officer once told him in Farmington. Daniel learned how to survive in silence, but he never forgot, not for a single day. Then one day in September 1980, a woman at a small liquor store in Albuquerque invited him to Sunday Mass, just another ordinary service. But that day, Daniel saw a nun in a black habit, limping slightly. And on her left temple, he saw a scar he had carried in his memory for 40 years. That morning, San Felipe de Neri Church, located in the heart of Albuquerque's Old Town, welcomed a special group of visitors. A contingent of nuns from the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna had arrived. They weren't part of the local parish, and they didn't speak to anyone. They stood in silence, heads bowed low, their faces hidden beneath long black habits that reached the floor. To the average churchgoer, they looked like humble, devout women, committed to a life of service and prayer. But to Daniel Nez, something felt off. As the congregation came forward to light candles and drop folded prayer requests into the wooden box beneath the altar, Daniel stayed in the back pew, watching quietly. He hadn't planned to be here. Marta, the woman who ran the liquor store he frequented, had invited him to Mass with a simple deal. Sit through one full service and she'd buy him a case of beer. He agreed just for the beer. But now, beer was the last thing on his mind. One of the nuns was carrying the prayer box away from the altar toward a side room. She walked with a limp, leaning heavily to the right, as if her left leg had once been seriously injured. Her robe dragged across the floor. As she turned to open the door, a breeze from the hallway lifted the edge of her veil, revealing part of her left temple. Daniel froze. A thick, raised scar ran from her temple down toward her cheekbone. Deep, wide, unmistakable. He had seen that scar before, in 1944. Alona had been struck with a wooden ruler when she tried to stop a nun from slapping Kaya in the laundry room. The wound bled down into her eye and left a lasting scar. Daniel had never forgotten. And now, 40 years later, he was staring at that same scar on the face of a silent nun in a church in Albuquerque. He almost stood up to call her name, but the door closed before he could speak. She disappeared behind thick stone walls. Only one thought echoed in Daniel's mind. If that was Alona, then his sisters weren't dead. Daniel didn't leave the church immediately after Mass. While others slowly filed out, he remained seated in the back pew, eyes fixed on the door where the scarred nun had disappeared. His hand gripped the old newspaper inside his jacket pocket like a reflex. 40 years of searching, hundreds of people he had questioned, thousands of rejections, and now he had seen a familiar face. No, not a face, a scar. But to Daniel, it was the most concrete lead he'd had in 4 decades. He rose slowly and walked out, trying not to draw attention. On the church steps, the afternoon sun spilled across the pavement. A white van, unmarked in the front, was parked along the side of the building. A small emblem from the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna was affixed to the side door. Daniel got into his beat-up pickup truck 2 blocks away and waited. He watched through the rearview mirror. Nearly an hour passed before the nuns began exiting the building. They walked in quiet formation. No talking, no breaks in rhythm. 5 women boarded the van. The limping one was among them. Daniel lit a cigarette. His mind was racing. No phone, no camera, just his eyes and his memory. The van pulled away. He waited until it turned off the main road before pulling out and following from a distance. The drive lasted over an hour. The van left central Albuquerque, passed sparse neighborhoods, merged onto a state highway, then veered off onto a rocky dirt road leading into the mountains. The further they drove, the more desolate the landscape became. Utility poles thinned. The radio went to static. Daniel kept several car lengths behind, eyes locked on the van's fading silhouette through the dust. Eventually, the van pulled up to a tall iron gate surrounding a concrete-walled compound. There were no signs, no cross, no name. Just a wooden guard shack and a security camera mounted on a steel pole. A young man stepped out from the shack. Native, possibly Navajo, maybe Zuni. He scanned the area, then opened the gate to let the van in. Once inside, the gate closed with a heavy metallic thud. Daniel didn't approach. He stopped his truck behind a low patch of desert brush about 100 meters away. He had no binoculars, no weapon, just old eyes that never forgot a detail. The compound didn't look like a monastery. It looked like a detention facility. The gate stood nearly 10 feet high, topped with what appeared to be prayer flags. But beneath them, Daniel recognized strands of barbed wire. There was no foot traffic, no bell tower, no singing. Daniel waited in his truck for over 3 hours. No one came out. Nothing moved inside. From a small drawer beside the sleeping bench, he pulled out an old wooden box. Inside were the last relics of his childhood. A worn photo of his 3 sisters sitting on the Carlisle Chapel steps, a turquoise necklace engraved with his tribal name, and a crumpled piece of paper Carlisle's 1945 lunch menu. On the back, a pencil drawing he had made in secret. His sisters in a quiet moment together inside the chapel, one braiding the other's hair. He studied the drawing. Alona's eyes, the shape of her lips, her small but upright frame. He remembered the nun's face. It was her. It had to be her. Daniel knew he needed to make contact, but he also knew this wasn't the kind of place you could just walk up to and start asking questions. And if he wanted to bring the truth into the light, he would have to go much deeper. After more than 3 hours of observation, the sun began to sink behind the Zuni Mountains. The compound's steel fencing glowed orange under the fading light. No one had come outside. No sounds, only the dry wind scraping across the desert and the distant hum of a truck engine. Daniel knew he couldn't sit there forever. If this was where the nuns lived, he had to be sure. And if Alona was really inside, he needed confirmation. He decided to approach the gate. The turquoise pendant hung outside his shirt. He laid a hand on the smooth stone to steady himself. It was the last thing his father had given him before being taken away engraved with their Navajo clan name. In his culture, it was a symbol of protection, and right now, Daniel needed all the protection he could get. As he neared the gate, the guard stepped out of the small wooden booth. He was native. Short-cropped hair, plain uniform, a radio on his belt. He stood tall, one hand casually resting at his hip like someone used to dealing with outsiders. Daniel didn't move too close. He stopped about 10 feet away, hands raised in peace. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "I just want to ask a few questions. No visitors. This is private property. Please turn around." Daniel didn't budge. "I think someone in there is my sister. I saw her at church this morning. She had a very specific scar on her left temple. She used to be at Carlisle." 1945. The guard's face stayed rigid, but his eyes drifted briefly to the turquoise pendant. And in that instant, something shifted. "You know what this means," Daniel said slowly. "You know who I am. I'm Navajo. Like you, I'm not here to disrespect anything. I just want to know, are they okay?" The guard remained silent for a few seconds. "I can't help you," he said. "No one gets in. No one meets them. They're cloistered nuns, vowed to silence. They live isolated by choice. Are they there by choice?" That question made the guard pause. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I don't know what happens inside. I just guard the gate. But you should go. This isn't a good place for someone like you to be hanging around." Daniel's voice dropped too. "If I want to talk to whoever's in charge, Milford." "How do I do that? The priest isn't here. His office is in Santa Rosa. If you really want answers, that's where to go." The guard looked back toward the compound, then added one final line before stepping back into the booth. "Don't say I told you, and leave now before someone else sees you." Daniel nodded. He turned and walked slowly back to his truck, heart pounding. Santa Rosa, Milford's office, that would be his next stop. He didn't know what waited for him there. But for the first time in 40 years, he had an address, a direction, and most of all, a reason to believe that his sisters might still be alive. Daniel left the compound just as the sun dipped behind the horizon. He didn't turn on his headlights, relying instead on the fading twilight to avoid attention. His hands gripped the steering wheel, cold sweat clinging to his fingers. Santa Rosa was about a 90-minute drive through the mountains, a quiet town nestled against a rocky slope known to few. By the time he arrived, night had nearly fallen. The main street was almost deserted, a few small shops still lit with dim neon signs. He didn't have a precise address, only what the gate guard had said. Father Milford's office, somewhere in Santa Rosa. It was all Daniel had. He stopped at a small gas station and asked the young woman working the night shift. She hesitated when he mentioned Milford's name. "Do you know where he works?" Daniel asked. "Where his office is?" She didn't answer right away. After a pause, she said, "I think he lives at the end of Elm Street. White adobe house, near the creek turnoff. No sign. But everyone in town knows?" Daniel thanked her. She just stared at him as he walked away. The house matched her description exactly. Single story, white walls, red tile roof. It looked like any other modest home in the area. No placard. No overt religious symbols except a small wooden cross hanging in the side window. A silver sedan was parked out front, its hood still warm. Daniel parked across the street and watched for a few minutes. The house was still, no movement, but there was a faint glow of light leaking through the curtains. He approached the door and knocked 3 times. No answer. He knocked again. Silence. The door was unlocked. Daniel pushed gently. It swung open. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then called out, "Hello? I'm looking for Father Milford. Is anyone here?" No response. Daniel stepped inside. The space was tidy, but something felt off. The sofa was askew, a table lamp tilted. On the tiled floor, drag marks streaked with dirt led from the entrance down a narrow hallway. Not just dirt. A mix of earth and something reddish-brown. He followed the trail down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. It ended at a rear door, which opened to a back patio, and there, carved into the natural rock behind the house, was a stone staircase leading down into the earth. Below was darkness and cold. Then he heard it. Not loud, but unmistakable. A woman's strained breathing, muffled sobs, and underneath it all the snap of a leather whip against flesh. Alongside it came the voice of a man, reciting scripture with terrifying fervor. "The Lord shall cleanse the wicked of their demons. Discipline is the path to redemption. Flesh must suffer so the soul may be freed." Daniel froze. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of it. There was no doubt anymore. Someone was being tortured. Something far worse than he'd imagined was happening here. And the priest behind it all was the same man who had stood behind his 3 sisters in that photograph from 40 years ago. Daniel turned away from the stone stairs that led underground. He didn't dare go any further. Another crack of the whip rang out, this time louder, followed by a woman's strangled cry. That was enough. He backed out, moved quickly down the hallway, through the living room, and out the front door. His mind had only one goal now: report it to the police. The Santa Rosa police station was near the town center, a single-story building with 2 patrol cars parked out front. He pushed open the door. The place smelled like old coffee and stale cigarette smoke. 2 officers were inside. One was a heavy-set middle-aged man with thinning gray hair and a half-buttoned shirt. The other was younger, sharper, staring at a computer screen. Both looked up when Daniel walked in, drenched in sweat, breathing hard, his voice nearly shaking. "I need to report a crime. There's a woman being beaten in Father James Milford's basement. I heard whipping. I heard her begging. He was reading scripture while hurting her." "You need to go there now," the older officer. The one who looked like he ran the place frowned. He set his mug down and looked Daniel over. The stale scent of alcohol still clinging to Daniel's clothes didn't help. "What's your name, and what exactly are you saying? You're accusing a priest of assaulting a woman?" "I'm not accusing. I witnessed it. I was just there. The door wasn't locked. I walked in. I saw drag marks on the floor. I heard the whip and the screaming." The younger officer cut in. "You're talking about Father James Milford? On Elm Street? You're saying he has a woman in his basement?" "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. He's hurting a nun. I think she's my sister." The older officer stood up, his tone shifting, immediately no longer polite, but hard and angry. "Listen here, you crazy Navajo. Father Milford is one of the most respected men in this town. He's the one who helped rebuild this community. He pulled us out of hard times. He's a good man. He doesn't do things like what you're describing." Daniel was stunned. He repeated, softer now, "I'm not making this up. I saw it. I heard it. Just go there. Just check." The officer stepped closer. His breath reeked of coffee and tobacco. You're admitting to entering a priest's private home, and now you're slandering him with claims of violence. I could have you arrested right now for trespassing and filing a false report." Daniel stepped back slightly. "I didn't break in. The door was open. I heard someone in distress. No one could imagine what I heard down there. Please, just one officer to verify." The older cop didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to a shelf lined with framed photographs. Police ceremonies, church events, and 2 specific portraits. He took down one of the frames. "This is Father James Milford Sr. He died 15 years ago, and this one he lifted the second frame is Father James Milford High, the one you're accusing. He serves our parish and runs the town's relief programs." Daniel looked at the photo. His arms went slack. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. The man in the picture was the same priest who stood behind his 3 sisters in the 1945 boarding school photograph. Older now, gray-haired, weathered, but the eyes, the posture, the mouth, unmistakable. 40 years ago, he stood in a newspaper photo praising the Carlisle Indian School. 40 years later, he was torturing a nun in the basement of his suburban home. And no one believed Daniel. Daniel walked out of the police station with his hands trembling and a dull ache pressing behind his eyes. He stood in the shadow of the parking lot, looking up at a sky without stars, and for the first time that day, he felt like he might collapse. Not from fear, but from a cold realization. The police would do nothing. They didn't believe him. They never intended to, and the man torturing his sister was worshipped by the town like a saint. Daniel opened the truck door and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. He took a deep breath, then reached into the glove compartment. Amid stacks of old papers, he pulled out a worn leather notebook. The cover was cracked, the spine split. On the first page, faded pencil read, "Contacts, what's left?" He flipped to the back. One name stared back at him. Clyde Yazzie. Researcher, University of New Mexico. Next to it, a landline number written in faint, smudged graphite. Daniel rummaged for a few coins. There was a payphone at a gas station just a block from the police station. He picked up the receiver and dialed. His heart pounded like a drum. 3 rings. Then a low, gravelly voice. "Hello? Yazzie Residence? Clyde, it's me, Daniel Nez. We met about 20 years ago, near that canyon by Cielco. I stopped you from falling when you were collecting plant samples. You told me if I ever needed anything, call you." Silence for a few seconds. "Daniel? Jesus, where are you?" "I'm in Santa Rosa. They changed the name from Cielco. I found something." "No, I found someone. I think one of my sisters is still alive. She's a nun. I saw her. She has a scar. She's alive, Clyde." "But I just got kicked out of the police station for accusing Father Milford of keeping someone in his basement." "Daniel, slow down. Are you telling me you personally witnessed this priest doing something illegal?" "I heard it. The whip, the scripture, a woman sobbing. She's my sister, I know it. But no one believes me. They treat that man like a holy figure." "Clyde, I don't have anyone else to call." Another pause. Then Clyde's voice dropped, calm and certain. "I'm coming. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Stay at the gas station. Don't move." Diary. 10 minutes later, a dented silver pickup rolled up to the payphone. Clyde stepped out, older than Daniel remembered, hair graying, lines carved into his face, but the eyes sharp and steady were the same. "Tell me everything. Every detail," Daniel told him. The church, the scar, the monastery, the gate, the guard, the house, the drag marks, the staircase, the whip, and finally, the police. When he finished, Clyde stood in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "I know someone in tribal law enforcement, Joe Begay. He works as a liaison between Navajo Nation and the state. If this involves a Catholic priest holding indigenous people, Joe has the authority to act. We have to call him now, and when he shows up, we need to be witnesses." Clyde drove. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, gripping the armrest, eyes locked on the road ahead. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Both men knew that after tonight, there would be no turning back. As they neared Father Milford's house, the sky turned a deep purple gray. The streetlights hadn't come on yet. The glow from the house windows flickered faintly harmless at a glance, but Daniel saw it for what it was. A signal. Clyde cut the engine behind a low patch of shrubs about 100 meters from the house. He killed the headlights. Daniel leaned forward. The silver sedan was still out front, curtains drawn. But this time there was movement. The lights inside flared brighter. At the doorway, 2 men in white robes, stained with dark patches, were carrying a woman in a black habit, limp, her head resting on one man's shoulder. Daniel held his breath. It was her, the nun with the scar. She was alive, but her face was streaked with blood. Her robes were torn. She couldn't walk. Just as they tried to force her into the back seat of the sedan, sirens cut through the air, bouncing off the canyon walls. Flashing lights approached 3 patrol vehicles speeding up the street. The lead car bore the markings of the Navajo Nation Police. The man who stepped out first was tall, broad-shouldered, with deep bronze skin and sharp eyes beneath his campaign hat, Joe Begay. 2 other officers followed one woman, one younger man, and an unmarked SUV rolled up behind them. Daniel and Clyde stepped out of their hiding spot with their hands up. Joe spotted Clyde immediately and gave a small nod. "There," Clyde pointed. "They're trying to move her." Joe didn't shout. His voice was steel. "We received reports of assault and unlawful confinement involving tribal members. I have full authority to inspect this property." By then, Santa Rosa's local police had arrived too, likely forced to respond due to the Navajo unit's presence. The same sheriff who had dismissed Daniel hours earlier now stood frozen, watching Father Milford, his shirt stained red, emerge from the house looking winded but composed. "This is church property," Milford declared. "You have no jurisdiction here. This woman is one of ours. She's undergoing spiritual purification." Joe didn't flinch. "We're here on legal grounds. This is now a tribal and state matter." A female officer opened the car door. The woman inside had passed out. Her face was bruised, lips split, arms lined with welts. Blood had soaked into the folds of her robe. Daniel stepped forward slowly. He stopped a few meters from the vehicle. Despite the years, despite the injuries, the scar on her left temple was still there. Daniel whispered, barely audible, "Alona." The woman stirred. Her head turned, eyes half open, and for the first time in 40 years, breaking her vow of silence, she whispered in broken Navajo, "Ashki Yaji." "Is that you?" At the Northwestern Regional Medical Center, Alona Nez was rushed into emergency care. She was dehydrated, suffering from multiple soft tissue injuries, showing signs of infection and early nerve trauma from prolonged malnutrition. Doctors found both fresh and old whip marks across her back, shoulders, and legs, clear impressions left by leather. Some scars had already healed. Others were still open. When asked her name, she replied, "I am no longer a nun. Do what needs to be done." Outside the treatment room, Daniel sat slumped forward, his head buried in his hands. Clyde stood nearby in silence. An hour later, Alona was transferred to a recovery room. Once doctors confirmed she was stable and conscious, Navajo Nation Police led by Joe Begay entered with Daniel and a female officer fluent in Navajo. Alona sat upright, leaning against a pillow. Her hair was tangled, lips cracked, but her eyes were sharp. When she saw Daniel, she didn't cry. She met his gaze and nodded once. Joe began calmly. "We need you to tell us what happened." "Inside the monastery, and before that," Alona took a deep breath. She didn't hesitate, didn't look away. "I was taken from Carlisle in 1945 along with Tasba and Kaya. It was right after the photo for the government paper. Father Reginald Milford came to the school that day, officially as a religious supervisor. After the photographers left, the nuns led us through the back hallway of the chapel. No one said anything. No one stopped it. He told us we'd been chosen, that God had marked us for a special purpose. thought the purity and loyalty of Native children were the key to connecting with the Virgin Mary. He brought us to a remote facility in the mountains not registered, not on any diocesan map. A group of cloistered nuns lived there, isolated, no contact with the outside world. Every one of them was Native. We were forced to take vows of silence, daily prayer, cycles of fasting, and whenever we failed to connect with the Virgin, we were punished. She paused, then continued. He made us drink wine mixed with herbal infusions, said it helped open our spirits. Then we had to write down messages from the Virgin. Each week, we received hundreds of prayer requests from all over, rich people, politicians, business leaders. They donated money in exchange for divine guidance. Joe asked, "Did you believe at the time that you were truly connecting with something?" At first, yes, we were brainwashed. But over time, we understood this was a spiritual operation for profit. Whoever wrote the answers people wanted to hear was spared. Whoever questioned got sent to the purification room. Joe asked again, "Was Milford the only one running this?" Alona nodded. He took over after his father died. No oversight, no audits. He recruited girls from boarding schools, native shelters, retirement homes. Always indigenous women because they're closer to the spiritual realm. The white nuns were kept upstairs, protected. None of them were ever touched. Daniel stepped closer, speaking softly. Tazba and Kaya. "Are they still alive?" Alona looked at him. Her voice softened. "They are. They're still there. They learned how to survive. They know what to write, when to stay quiet. They haven't left me. They're just surviving." She added, "They'll recognize you too, even after all these years." Joe nodded and turned to the female officer. "Prepare a full search warrant for the compound. Bring in medical teams. We're bringing everyone else out of the dark." The next morning, the hospital hallway was unusually still. The sun had yet to rise fully, and dim light filtered through the windows, casting a pale gray hue across the white-green walls. Daniel sat on a metal bench outside room 12. In his hands was a folded piece of old paper-pencil sketch he'd drawn in 1945, 3 little girls sitting together in a chapel, one braiding her sister's hair, one singing. He'd drawn it by candlelight after a quiet evening mass when he caught a glimpse of his sisters seated together. The elevator doors opened. Joe Begay stepped out, flanked by 2 female officers, and between them were 2 older women in black habits. Both were thin, their expressions cautious, but when the overhead lights touched their faces, Daniel stood. The first tall, silver-haired, hollow-cheeked, yet with eyes that still searched, was Tazba. The second, shorter, with wide, disbelieving eyes, was Kaya. Daniel stepped forward slowly. The 3 of them stopped in the middle of the hallway, just looking at each other. Then Kaya whispered, "Ashki Yaji?" Daniel nodded, his eyes filling with tears that didn't fall. Tazba lifted a hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold something inside that had waited 40 years to escape. She stepped forward and embraced Daniel tightly. Kaya followed a heartbeat later, arms clinging to his back as if afraid he might vanish again. "We thought you were dead," Tazba said, voice trembling. "We didn't dare hope." No one believed. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed them the old folded paper in his hand, gently opening it in front of them. Both women stared at the worn sketch. 3 small figures, one braiding hair, one singing, one smiling. Kaya gasped. "I remember this. You drew it by candlelight after evening mass. I remember you hid it inside your torn hymnal." Tazba whispered, "No matter where I was, I always believed you hadn't forgotten us." They held each other for so long that a nurse had to gently gesture for them to come inside. When the 3 sisters entered the room, Alona was sitting up in bed, her hands still bandaged but her eyes clear and bright. She looked at them, then at Daniel. "We survived," she said. "Not because of a miracle, not because of luck, but because you never stopped looking." Within 48 hours of the joint raid by Navajo Nation police and state authorities on Father James Milford's home, a federal-level investigation was launched. Initially, more than 20 indigenous women were removed from the remote mountain compound posing as the handmaid sisters of Saint Dymphna. Most had lived there for over a decade. Some more than 30 years. They had no identification, no medical records. Several couldn't even recall their year of birth. All of them were native, and all of them were former children taken from federal Indian boarding schools after World War II. Inside the compound, police discovered an underground prayer room outfitted with leather restraints, a wooden table fixed with bindings, and speakers broadcasting scripture. A storage vault of prayer request forms, over 60,000 applications from across the U.S., including from wealthy donors, politicians, and major religious institutions. More than $1.3 million in undeclared cash hidden in safes, completely off the books. Father James Milford II was arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment, systematic physical abuse, interfaith fraud, exploitation of vulnerable adults under federal law, psychological coercion under the guise of ritual purification. In court, he held his position: I am a servant of God. I cleansed their souls. I did nothing wrong. Denier. As for the Nez sisters, their testimonies alongside physical evidence from the compound and statements from over 10 additional survivors became the foundation of the prosecution. Tasba and Kaya agreed to cooperate with the FBI as key witnesses. Alona, though still in recovery, appeared at the first preliminary hearing as the only surviving witness to speak openly about the prayer room beneath the monastery. Media coverage began small local papers at first, then national networks. But what made the story explode wasn't just the religious abuse, it was this. 3 Navajo girls disappeared in 1945. No police report, no search, no record, and they were ultimately found in the custody of a priest who had once appeared in a government newspaper, praising Native assimilation. Records from the Carlisle Indian School, sealed since 1960, were reopened in the aftermath. There, authorities discovered documentation that Father Milford Sr. had been granted federal permission to relocate boarding school students for special ministerial purposes. No one had ever been charged. No one had ever questioned it. In June 1986, the first trial opened in Albuquerque. Milford's lawyers denied all charges, requesting a closed hearing due to matters of religious privilege and spiritual confidentiality. The request was denied. At the front of the courtroom sat Daniel Nez. In his hands, the same pencil sketch from 1945, faded but still clear. He never took his eyes off the man in the orange prison uniform, standing with his head lowered, hands clenched around a Bible, still convinced he was the righteous one. 1 year after the trial, in a small community center in Window Rock, within the Navajo Nation, the 3 Nez sisters appeared publicly for the first time, not as victims, but as survivors. They didn't wear habits. They didn't wear school uniforms. They wore traditional Navajo skirts, hand-sewn from fabric donated by members of their community. Daniel stood beside them, holding a laminated copy of the old black-and-white photo, the one taken in 1945 of 3 little girls on the steps of the Carlisle Chapel. Now, that photo was no longer just evidence. It was a symbol of a truth that could no longer be erased. Joy. In the aftermath, the U.S. federal government officially reopened sealed archives related to Native American boarding schools. A national initiative was launched to trace missing students, with tribal nations across the country taking the lead. Carlisle, Genoa, Sherman, Haskell, once touted as pillars of assimilation, were now appearing in headlines again, but this time as sites of systemic abuse. Daniel Nez, the man who had spent 40 years living in a rusted camper with a crumpled newspaper, now lives with his 3 sisters in a modest home near the New Mexico border, built for them by local volunteers. They aren't wealthy. They receive no money from large charity foundations, but they have their ancestral land, their real names, And each morning begins with a meal that no one has to beg for. Alona runs a small support circle for Native women who've experienced religious abuse. Tasba works with an oral history archive, helping to record testimonies from other survivors of former boarding schools. Kaya is relearning her native language, the one she was once forbidden to speak, and now teaches it to children in the community. One afternoon, Daniel took the old photograph out to the porch, sitting beside a small firewood pile. A child from the neighborhood walked up and asked, "Grandpa, why do you still carry that old picture?" He smiled for the first time in many years, because it used to be proof, but now it's a reminder that there are things we cannot let others forget for us.